Then it came next that some of them went out to gather on the Sabbath. So now they've already disobeyed. And then he says, let each one stay in his place. That's our big quotes there. Stay in his place. Now, when you look at the Hebrew, and we're going to look at some verses here, this may not be referring to staying physically in a place, but rather staying in your position as it relates to authority. Oh, boy. Rabbi, where are you going now? Maybe this isn't talking about just physically staying in a spot, because they left their position of authority and disobeyed and took it upon themselves self-sovereignly to go out and do what they wanted to do. How do I know that this is a reasonable conclusion? Because that sounds very strange probably to all of you. Rabbi, where are you getting that? I don't know. Let's go to Genesis 36. Bereshit, Genesis 36. We'll read verse 33. This is the same Hebrew word where it says, let each one stay in his place. Now notice that actually in the verse it said two things. It said, let each one stay in his place, and it says, do not let anyone go out of his place. And guess what? Two different words. Well, let's understand. Okay? The way the word is kind of used in the Hebrew there. So here, the first one here is talking about, the same word here is in Genesis 36. 36 and verse 33. And Bela died, and Yovav, son of Zerach, of Betzra, reigned in his place. Is that talking about a physical location? Or is it talking in the position of authority? Oh, wait a minute. Let's look at verse 34. And Yovav died, and Husham of the land of the Temanites reigned in his place. And Husham died, and Hadad, the son of Bedad, who smote Midian in the field of Moab, reigned in his place. Verse 36, and Hadad died, and Samla of Masrecha reigned in his place. In verse 37, we see another person reigning in his place. In verse 38, reigning in his place. Are we getting the hint here? So there's a reason to believe that this word is not necessarily just talking about a physical location. By the way, go to Exodus 29 and verse 29. Exodus 29 and in verse 29. And the set-apart garments of Aharon are for his sons after him, to be anointed in them and to be ordained in them. Okay, so here we're reading in verse 29. Look at what happens when we get to verse 30. The priest from his sons in his place puts them on for 7 days. In other words, the priest who had the position of authority was to put them on his sons. Again, we're talking about a position of authority. Look at Leviticus chapter 6 and verse 22. Oh, when this hit me last night, as I was this is always the way it works. I have the teaching put together, then I do a review, and it lasts until about 3 in the morning. So you wonder sometimes why I get here at 12:30. But when he showed me this, I was thinking, oh, is this not a little different than all the people making an argument that they can't leave their house, they're supposed to just be at home? Leviticus chapter 6 and verse 22. 6:22. And the anointed priest from among his sons, who was in his position, in his place of authority, he prepares it a law forever to Yahweh. Deuteronomy 10 and verse 6. Are we seeing something, a pattern here? Deuteronomy 10 and in verse 6. Now the children of Israel set out from the wells of Benai Yakan to Mosra. Aharon died there, and he was buried there, and Eleazar, his son, became priest in his place. He took his position of authority. I could go on and on. There's a million of them. And so now let's go back and look at Exodus 16. Okay, Exodus 16. Hopefully this is just like light bulbs should be shooting off in your head, okay? Exodus 16. And it says here, now remember the process. They were fine. In verse 25, Moses says, eat it today, for today's the Sabbath. Today you do not go in the field, gather for 6 days, and on the seventh day there'll be none. And it came to be that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather, and they found none. And then Moses was told by Yahweh, how long are you guys going to just be rebellious? You're not going to listen. You're going to refuse to guard my commands. And then he says in verse 29, let each one stay in his place, in his position of authority. Stop being self-sovereign and thinking you can decide what you need to do on my time and my day that I told you what to do and what not to do. And then he says, do not let anyone go out of his place on the seventh day. So now, because they acted like 3-year-olds, he says, now you need to go to your room and stay there. So this does literally mean stay physically in your spot. So because they rebelled, because they were self-sovereign, because they were not listening, he said, you need to stay in your position of authority, not usurp authority, not go out beyond the bounds of your authority, and on top of that, go to your room and stay there. Now, this is Exodus 16. We're going to get to eventually Leviticus 23, where they're being instructed as a corporate nation now as they're getting prepared to go into the land, and saying, look, when you go there, now that you're no longer, hopefully, 3-year-olds, and you can be trusted to try to make an attempt at least to guard my instructions, my Torah, guard the Torah, you need to understand that this is a day that has a Mikra Kodesh, a commanded assembly. And so as long as you can stay in your place of authority, you can leave your physical place and go to the place that I've told you to go to gather together. So remember, the people didn't follow the instructions correctly initially, but what we see is back in Exodus 16, at the last verse there, it says, so the people rested on the seventh day. In verse 30, they actually finally got it at some point. They did rest. But it took him scolding them and treating them like little children, saying, you don't seem to understand your place, so now go to your room and stay there on Shabbat. But he wants to meet with us as a group. And so that punishment, just like when you send your child to timeout, is your child still there? Did you let him out eventually? That's what we're seeing here. And so, but see, you have to get the context of the flow. They were told what to do. The very first time they did it fine because they didn't know what was going on. And then, very quickly, they were not guarding. They were just going to say, well, I'll just do whatever, how bad could it be? I'll go out there, I'll get more stuff, whatever. Probably those that didn't prepare the double, they just ate the double. Hey, I'm just going to stuff my face. There'll be more tomorrow. They weren't trusting him, and they weren't listening. So the biggest part of this is they weren't staying in their place authoritatively. Is that making sense now? When you break Shabbat, you are not staying in your place. Whatever you do. Even if you're doing it in your house, you can break Shabbat in your house. And if you're breaking Shabbat, it's because you've no longer stayed in your place of limited authority. In other words, you didn't stay under authority like you should. He's saying, how long are these people going to refuse to listen to me? When are they going to recognize that I am their authority? The self-sovereign stuff has got to stop, he's saying. Okay, so hopefully that helps clarify some of this. So we are not to do this in our house necessarily. We are to do this with people together as best we can. That doesn't make, by the way, I got to clarify this because people will not understand. You are not in sin and wrong and rebellious and profaning it if you're doing this in your house. Some of you don't have any place to go. He understands that. Okay? There's refusing and choosing not to, and there's also that which you had no choice. In other words, that which is outside of your control. If you have no place to go, if you have nothing that you can do, if you have no options, then he understands that. That's one of the reasons why we have provided you with this live stream, or for those of you that are listening or watching, we provide a live stream of our service to try to at least connect up people as best we can who don't have a place viably to connect to, who do not have a place viably to connect to. This is critical. So you are to make the effort to connect with others where he's placed his name, where he's doing what he's doing, even if it's in your living room on a screen, until the day he provides you with a physical place you can go. And by the way, if you're home fellowshipping, that is a stepping stone. That is a way to gather some people together of like mind and eventually bring it outside. Now, if your home fellowship is publicly accessible and publicly available, then that would be one thing. But if it's not, then you're really still not doing this public assembling. So the home fellowship has got to be the initial place, not the ending place. You see them doing this in, people say, well, look in the New Testament, the early church in the first century, blah, 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 all met in houses. Yes, they did, but not all of them, and not forever. A lot of them met at the synagogues. A lot of the synagogues were Messianic synagogues. Once they heard about Messiah, embraced Messiah. And so a lot of the synagogues, which is where people went, still were teaching people Torah in the context now of Mashiach, of Messiah. But the home fellowships were places where there wasn't enough people gathered together to take them out somewhere else, and so they would gather together. Also, they needed to be in some place where it was safe. Remember, the first century people were under persecution. You're not. It wasn't safe for them to just go necessarily out there and find a place in the public to do these things. First century people were under Roman authority. They weren't just free. They weren't living in the land under Israel authority. They were under Roman authority. So there are a lot of other pieces of the context to explain why they were doing what they were doing. So hopefully we're embracing these things, because this is really important that we're starting to break these things down.